All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. Peace, welcome. Make sure to take a moment to, like the video, of course, like subscribe to the channel if you're not already, send the link out, share it on social media, invite some more people in here for this conversation. I'm sure we'll be joined momentarily by folks from the Remix Morning Show over on Black Power Media. Hello, Erica. Good to see you, Ricky. So today, the story of this conversation basically is that Tamanisha John, who's our guest today, wrote a really, I thought very, interesting, good thread on Twitter recently, talking about thinking about Caribbean Revolution through three examples and talking about Haiti, Cuba, and Grenada. And so I thought that would be one. We've had some discussion. It's more probably on the Haitian Revolution than Grenada. Obviously, a couple conversations on Cuba, and so it would just a lot fill in some gaps and stuff that we've talked about, but also the way that she was thinking about them as she was laying them out is just really interesting in terms of talking about, how I mean, it's sort of a conversation about revolution, but also counter-revolution and counterinsurgency, right? Like, what are the different methods that imperialism uses to try to sabotage or overthrow revolutionary gains? So really excited to get into this conversation. Dr. John is an assistant professor in the Department of Politics at York University. She studies Caribbean development, sovereignty and politics, as well as Canadian foreign policy, economic imperialism, financial exclusion, and corporate power. She has published in leading peer-reviewed journals, including Class, Race, and Corporate Power, the Review of Radical Political Economy, and Social and Economic Studies. Tamanisha, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's great to be in conversation with you. I know, I've followed your work for a long time, specifically followed you on Twitter, probably for the better part of a decade now. And I know, like, a couple years ago, Josh was co-hosting this other podcast that was called Return to the Source podcast, and they had you on as a guest, at that point. Anyways, I'm really excited to be here to talk with you today and to kind of talk about this thread and just have a bigger conversation around it. So, I think to start, let's just start with, you say Haiti, Cuba, and Grenada are all informative cases of revolution in the Caribbean. So why don't we start with Haiti and kind of walk through the aspects of the Haitian Revolution and counter-revolution against Haitian Revolution, that against Haitian liberation, that you are thinking are most illustrative or important to examine and learn from. As you acknowledge in the context of your thread, both in the beginning and the end, like, obviously you're thinking about this right now in terms of what's going on in Haiti currently still, but also obviously is a historical process that has a lot of different, ebbs and flows to it. So, yeah, let's start the conversation there.
Yes. So the funny thing is that I made that thread um, sort of like out of an anger response. So anytime that I'm ultra posting on Twitter, it's because I see something in the news that gets me upset, or I see someone say something that gets me upset. And in the context of that thread, I had just came out doing another podcast on Left Reckoning, and I was talking about Haiti on there. And then, of course, anytime you do any sort of interview or podcast, you get DM requests, and I had a lot of people DM requesting me about Haiti, saying like, "Oh, you know, Haitians are to blame for their problem. We're already out of Haiti, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera." And what upset me about that was just how the Haitian Revolution in the present is sort of used to almost absolve the Europe and the West of sort of intervention and occupation in Haiti. A lot of people believe that simply because the revolution happened and Haiti kicked out all of the white people, that all of a sudden neo-colonial domination is no longer a factor in Haiti, and that's just not true. And it frustrated me because a big point that I made during that podcast interview was that it is important for us not to exceptionalize the Haitian Revolution, because when you do, you have a lot of these sorts of racist analyses. And of course, you have the famous white genocide ones, or you have these sort of pro colonial analyses. Oh, it's because Haiti gained independence that it's in this current situation, because of how it gained independence through that revolution. And what these analyses do is, one, it again absolves the West and Europe of current interference in Haiti, but it also blames the Haitian Revolution for Haiti's current situation, or it uses the revolution to victimize Haiti and Haitians themselves. But what I instead wanted to showcase in that thread is that Haiti's revolution has informed its history and its ongoing occupation and foreign intervention precisely because it informed how Haiti was to be integrated into the global Western system of capitalism. And I point out when I go through those three revolutions how each of them, staving off imperialism or being subjected to it, it's all because there was this need for these states to be integrated into the Western capitalist system. And so, very briefly, again, because Haiti is talked about a lot of people know that the Haitian Revolution happened between 1791 and 1804, and that is a 13-year long span of a protracted struggle. And what that means is that it wasn't just that they had a revolution to end chattel slavery or end African enslavement, but Haiti's revolution was a clear rejection of the plantation system, which dominated all of the West Indian colonies by different European powers, and it was also a rejection of the capitalist regime and European colonialism that both enabled and justified it. And it was also a rejection of the enslavement of African people and the sort of violence and exploitation justified towards enslaved Africans through the system of enslavement that was propped up by European capitalism. And so many people seem to take for granted as well that France had all of these European powers and even the United States come to its aid in its failed attempts to recolonize or completely retake over Haiti. But what should not be taken for granted is that a big part of the difficulty in them recolonizing Haiti as the first free Black republic and first free republic in the Americas or in the Western Hemisphere in general was that it upset our current understanding, or back then it upset the current understandings of the empire and its relationship to its colony. That would be today's equivalent of a revolution happening and dealing a major death blow to capitalism and our current global system of exploitation. And again, I say this not to exceptionalize it, but to point out that the Haitian Revolution upset what was seen as normal social and economic relationships of its day. And those relationships privileged France just as it privileged European imperialism and capitalism. And the post-revolution environment in Haiti thus had a momentous task. So it wasn't just that the revolution happened and now everything is great. It's that no, because the revolution upset these social and economic relations, it was tasked with creating new social and economic relations, and they would have to do it within a hemisphere and a world system hostile to the idea of the actualization of African equality, hostile to the idea and actualization of changing property relations that did not privilege European imperialism and capitalism and the plantation system in the Caribbean. And within this context, it's not just that Haiti was the first to do it, but the Haitian Revolution had a lot of trouble consolidating itself. And so again, we champion the Haitian Revolution, but less people are willing to study what did the post-revolution environment look like beyond, European powers rejected it, the Western Hemisphere rejected it. What this meant, or what this rejection, or some people call it isolation, meant was that when the Haitian Revolution tried to actualize changing specific social and economic relations, a lot of that was hampered, or they were kept from doing it due to external intervention, massive aggression, and the overall geography of the country, because Haiti is a big country. And of course, you also had the debt owed to France And what this meant was that in terms of viable economic choices in the post revolutionary period in Haiti, you saw sort of regressive, exploitative economic labor practices that continued into the First Republic. And so, whereas some ownership was disrupted, overall, how production processes worked in Haiti, how ownership patterns were in Haiti, they weren't completely upset or aggravated. And so, in other words, the revolution was not able to complete its task because in the post revolutionary environment, you saw the continuation of certain patterns of economic privileges, aided and maintained by continuous and frequent intervention, occupation, and what people like to bundle up and call in Haiti today corruption, which has been endemic in Haiti for a very long time. And all of this aimed at maintaining somewhat colonial or neo-colonial ties to keep Haiti integrated into Western capitalism, but as a subjected or dependent counterpart to it. And so much of the promises of the Haitian Revolution remain complete. And worse yet, what you have are these competing processes to sort of fix that unfinished revolution. In other words, it was enslaved Africans and their allies who pushed the Haitian Revolution forward to become free from bonded labor and French colonialism. However, external forces guaranteed through continuous physical, economic, and other kinds of violence that economic relations would be forcefully maintained in Haiti. And this is the struggle that continues today, which is why Haitians continue to be against foreign interference, intervention, and occupation in their country. And we see the same mechanisms almost by the West being used, including regressive labor laws. And so they don't want to ever increase the minimum wage in Haiti or do it by mere cents on the dollar. Not only in relation to debt to France, but today you have these international financial institutions like the IMF and others. And so you have those two competing mechanisms that remain in Haiti, that sort of struggle and promise for freedom and economic actualization of that freedom being hampered and denigrated and just suppressed by direct, overt, and covert Western interference.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I should clarify too, I certainly didn't mean to suggest that Haiti is discussed too much or, that it just merely of just thinking about our own episodes that we've actually probably talked about it more than we have Grenada or even Cuba, which is interesting and something that we should certainly round out in our coverage of things. But also what you said too about people coming into your DMs to like it's fascinating. I mean, like we just had Jemima Pierre on like sometime in I think October or November, right? And um because of, current events, things continuing to happen, in terms of intervention and also the um I don't even know. There was another. Was it a coup? Like what was the latest thing that just happened in terms of the president, the so-called puppet president stepped down, right? Was basically what it was.
Yeah. But I think
Yeah.
around October or November, you had them like trying to figure out who's going to be the military force that goes into Haiti.
Yeah. Yeah, right. And so that's what we were talking about. We were talking about the Kenyan-led, sort of international coalition that was, being sent by the imperialist forces to sort of do that work of the intervention, um, the occupation there. But yeah, that it was the recent stepping down of the appointed prime minister, U.S. appointed, core group appointed, I guess is the proper term. Um, but anyway, as that happened, a whole bunch more people started watching it, and as they watch it, the YouTube comments just become filled with like, I mean, a few people who obviously are appreciative of the content, but it's just like really weird the way that people react to that to Haiti, like you said, of like feeling the need to explain to you as if you don't understand, right? Like, no, really, it's Haitians' fault that things are like this. Is like the what they want to say, and yeah, it's interesting how deep and embedded that is within a lot of folks. Uh, so anyway, the next thing that I did want to get to in this was to talk, and folks, if you have questions too, feel free to leave them in the chat. We'll kind of go through this, and then I'll try to get to stuff that people have along the way. Um, but I want to go to Cuba next because you kind of talk about these three in chronological order in your thread, and I think it's interesting to kind of do that, move through them. Obviously, the Cuban Revolution is about 150 years later. So it's a very different time period. Also very disruptive, obviously, to the order of the day. So what are your thoughts on that? And maybe if you want to say something too about some of those shifts that happen in that, I mean, it is kind of in some ways, like interesting, right? That it takes a whole like 150 years before you have another major revolution in the Caribbean, if we want to think about it that way. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so a big part of my thread that I posted in Angry Response sort of talked about this concept of political consciousness and political consciousness of the masses. And I think that in order for me to get to my answer to that question, I do want to touch on this notion of political consciousness. Um, because there's different types of political consciousness. Of course, there's positive political consciousness, or what I would call positive political consciousness, and that's what gets us towards, you know, political, economic, and social liberation. And then you also have sort of negative political consciousness, or what I call people swayed by propaganda, or people just willingly misinforming others. And the reason why I think talking about political consciousness is important before I talk about the 150-year span between the Haitian Revolution and the revolution that takes place in Cuba is what I also feel is ignored in the West is what I would call positive political consciousness. And what I mean by that is that in the West, you meet a lot of people who support struggles against Western imperialism. Um, which is only odd because alongside people willing to support struggles against Western imperialism in other countries, you also see people in the West more ready to critique or point out what I would say is unknown or negative political consciousness. Um, and this is only weird because those same people, they don't want to talk about chauvinism at all because they don't want to be implicated in chauvinism and sort of how we view other countries. However, they are more likely to lend their critique for when they believe the masses are uninformed in these sorts of other places, or if they believe struggle in these other places aren't as socialist or as communist as they want or as they expect them to be. And so people in the West have no problem saying, we support X struggle because it is against Western imperialism, even if X struggle doesn't follow this correct line that I would want it to follow, or isn't sufficiently communist or socialist enough, et cetera, et cetera. However, when it comes to states like Haiti or Cuba, people seem to either downplay or ignore the level of positive political consciousness in both of those places, which is required to maintain struggle for as long as Haiti has, and also defend oneself against imperialism as long as Cuba has. And so the struggle against imperialism, intervention, and occupation is not a top down process, but one that requires an organized and a conscious people. And pretending that to not be the case, you strip people of their role in their own struggle. And you see that happening a lot today where people are talking about sort of revolutionary or non revolutionary leaders in Haiti, for instance, and they want to do all of these highlighting of these revolutionary or non-revolutionary people in Haiti, but then the Haitian masses are missing from that conversation. Or you see it when people talk down about the Cuban government, as if the Cuban government is the only thing that exists in Cuba, and Cuban people are somehow absent or don't exist in Cuba. And so that is how you strip people of their role in their own struggle, and also the fact that they are involved in their struggle. And so they either want to blame the government or highlight individuals, et cetera, et cetera. But it is positive political consciousness in both Haiti and in Cuba that have, one, helped Cuba stave off imperialist aggression for so long, and two, made it so that Haitians are very aware of which forces they oppose in their country. Haitians are not out in the streets saying that we vaguely oppose Western imperialism. They're saying, no, we oppose the core group, we oppose the UN, we oppose the United States, we oppose Canada, and we oppose France. And I always make it a point to point out those five entities as what Haitians oppose, because sometimes you have people say, oh, Haitians oppose the US. And then again, it absolves Canada, France, the UN, and all of these other forces that they're directly saying that they oppose from sort of that history. So that then you would have people saying, like, oh, US out of Haiti, but Canada is fine because at least French Canadians can speak French and relate to the Haitians. And it's like, you're ignoring what the Haitian people are saying. And so that's why I highlighted political consciousness in my thread. And political consciousness is also going to be used to explain sort of the 150-year, and I wouldn't say gap between the Haitian Revolution and Cuban Revolution, mostly because you've had a lot of rebellions throughout the Caribbean in that time period. But what I will say is why it is important for us to actually learn about struggles and support people as they are engaged into them or in them. So the link between Haiti's revolution and Cuba's is actually not that surprising when you consider the fact that for a long while after its revolution, Haiti was used as an example in sort of the Caribbean or West Indies colonies of what would happen if Caribbean countries became free. So, in other words, Haiti was used to fearmonger against those who would push for or advocate for revolution in other islands and also independence in those other islands. And it was completely and always spoken about as backwards or as barbaric. And it's not just that this fear mongering happened, but this fear mongering on Haiti also existed alongside an even more intense policing of colonies in the Caribbean, of any sort of rebel activity in the region as well. And it would not be until sort of different slave rebellions and justice oriented movements stating the fact that colonized people are human and the Great Depression that hit European colonies, as well as World War II and its aftermath, that in the Caribbean and throughout the colonized world, you had a space open up where people started to be very vocal about asking in very public ways, well, how can we liberate or help to liberate Europe and the so-called mother country if we ourselves are living in these colonies and are not free? If we ourselves are in these colonies and not regarded as human, how can we be expected to rescue or save these other humans? And if we ourselves in these colonies suffer due to economic policies that have been elsewhere. And so continuous slave rebellions and justice-oriented movements, the Great Depression in Europe, the United States, and any times there's a depression in the United States or in Europe, it hits much harsher in the sort of the dependent economies of the world. And again, people sort of brush that over. And also the aftermath of World War II opened up space where European countries couldn't be as heavy-handed on sort of policing rebel activities in the colonies as they once had. And so you had a lot of people who started publishing, writing, holding rallies and events, asking, why are our lives worth less? Why are we being exploited for other people's benefits, even though we're being told that we wouldn't be able to govern our own resources? We're already doing this work, so how can we not take over or rule for ourselves? And why can't we witness or experience the fruit of our own labor and resources? And these questions after World War II, especially, even resonated in more conservative Caribbean countries like Jamaica. And when I say conservative Caribbean countries like Jamaica, I'm just pointing out the fact that even Jamaica's independence parties, its far left independence parties or nationalist parties, including under Michael Manley, they still worship the British Westminster system and British ways of life. So even in a conservative country like Jamaica, these sorts of questions about relationships between colonies and empires started to become very much aggravated in the aftermath of World War II. They even saw a split in conservative nationalist parties or they weren't considered conservative, they were considered left. But they even caused a split in these sort of nationalist parties, with some people saying, you know what, we are pro trade unions and we are anti imperialist. And then another set saying, but wait a minute, if you take that stand, then we will never get our independence or what have you. And so it is in this context of consciousness around freedom, being able to be public without being as policed as it was, that sort of allowed for or gave space for not just the Cuban Revolution, but more revolutions to be possible throughout the world. So, in the context of reinvigorated consciousness around freedom as tied to anti-imperialism, which even in theory European powers supported, since the advances of Nazi Germany, it provides some context to the Cuban Revolution, and simultaneously, mother country retreats from colonies, given the devastation in Europe, also meant that rebel activity in colonies had more room to maneuver, having formerly been super policed by empire, given the Haitian Revolution. And it is also the case that economic actualization for Cuba at the time was a greater possibility than it was when Haiti had its revolution. So Haiti or Cuba was not alone in the world, given the overall declared pushes for decolonization and a more international movement for decolonization against imperialism. And there was also, of course, the assistance and solidarity to be had with the Soviet Union, which was a global power at the time, that allowed states like Cuba to pursue alternatives which helped. And so by the time that 1953 and then 1959 came around, there was a sort of global and regional awareness that the Haitian Revolution was correct in its goals that it had set out. And again, when Haiti did it, it was the first in the hemisphere to do so. Um, and Cuba's revolution should also be defended. So you had people saying, or in hindsight, saying the Haitian Revolution was correct. Cuba's revolution should be defended. We should learn from what happened to Haiti to not let that happen to Cuba. Cuba should not be succumb to or surrender to imperial aggression. And at this time that all of these talks are happening, Haiti was being ruled by Western backed dictatorship. And there was this growing consciousness within the Western hemisphere about Black power, its rejection of capitalism and white supremacy, European and also American imperialisms. At the time, Haiti thought that, the US would be a sort of brother, having had a revolution as well, but that was not the case. And during Cuba's revolution, there was no pretense that the US was anything but a part of the sort of European and Anglo-Spirit alliance when it came to imperial aggression. Uh, and so the Cuban revolutionary context was much less isolating than the Haitian revolutionary context had been.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. And so, I think that leads into our next question, which is to sort of talk about what you think is the most illustrative about what is the most illustrative about the Cuban example. Of the three revolutions that you discuss, obviously it's been in many ways the most successful, certainly in terms of length of time, maintaining its revolutionary status, and in terms of maintaining a project of sovereignty against imperialism and seeking to build socialistic relations. Of course, at the same time as we say that, we have to acknowledge that there's a completely inhumane and illegal and ridiculous blockade that Cuba continues to be under. That even recently, there's always attempts to take any form of like dissatisfaction or unrest that happens within Cuba and make this the reason why we need, to overthrow the Cuban government and bring in capitalism, etc. And so there's a constant way in which, um, one, we don't talk about, for instance, those protests and things like that as connected to the fact that there's a blockade that denies people access to all kinds of necessary goods, services, medicines, food. Um, but also, it's Cuba's constantly under, imperialist assault, both materially and ideologically. Um, and yet it does persist, right? And so, yeah, talk a little bit about what you think is kind of illustrative about the Cuban model in comparison with the other models you're talking about.
Mhm. And so, what I think is illustrative of the Cuban model isn't new. And I should note that in 1972, Walter Rodney gave a speech on some thoughts on the political economy of the Caribbean. And in that speech, he said, and I still don't believe in the present this has really been done yet, he said that we need to understand what the Cuban people have achieved, and there needs to be a serious analysis of Cuba and its relationship to the rest of Caribbean society. And we have to really understand how Cuba has been able to maintain itself in the face of external aggression and maintain itself in the face of counter revolutionary actions by the petty bourgeois. So it's not just that there's this external aggression only, but there is a petty bourgeois in Cuba uh, that has been allowed to develop itself because of the blockade that also needs to be studied. But even that, growing class in Cuba hasn't been able to successfully lobby counter revolution in Cuba, and that needs to be studied. Needs to be studied. And in studying this, it requires us to seriously engage with this question of political consciousness of the masses and their relationship to democracy. And this is especially because uh, so when I went through sort of the 150 years from Haiti's revolution to Cuba's revolution, I talked about the changed global context that they were operating in. But even today, there is a changed global context that Cuba is operating in. And so Cuba's revolution today is ideologically sustained internally. So the people in Cuba, again, they are very politically aware of the conditions internal to them and how it is aggravated externally. And a lot of people underplay that. And so then when there are attempts to lobby counter-revolutionary activity in Cuba, and people say, no, we're protesting against these things, but we're very aware that the blockade is in part to blame, then people are all of a sudden like, oh my God, why are they talking about the blockade? And it's like, no, because they are aware of their conditions, why it happens, and how it happens. Um, and so Cuba's revolution today is ideologically sustained internally, whereas its economic actualization is supported externally in international institutions and with other capitalist and non capitalist states. And so Cuba has maintained itself in the present, but it would 100% benefit even more if it existed in a global environment that was not overrun with neocolonial governance and Western security domination. Let's be serious. And I lived in Miami for a few years, and I'm bringing this up because I want us to talk about the first point, which is that Cuba and any analysis of Cuba must be done and must also be explained by its relationship to the rest of Caribbean society. When I lived in Miami, you had so many reactionary Cubans who would get upset saying, like, oh my God, there's food shortages in Cuba. Oh my God, my family doesn't have access to this, this, this. And me, as a Caribbeanist and someone who's been to many, many Caribbean islands, including Cuba, I would say, but all of those problems exist in these other capitalist islands, except many times it's worse. And they would get completely upset. And that's because, again, there's this thing that's done to Cuba that, again, I also talked about in Haiti, but people want to exceptionalize Cuba. All of Cuba's problems exist because of socialism or communism or because of the revolution. But when you exceptionalize Cuba in that way, and you don't talk about Cuba's relationship to the other countries in the hemisphere, meaning the other Caribbean countries that it would directly be compared to, what you're essentially doing is absolving dependent capitalism and what that has looked like for all of the other states in the region, right? Uh, Cuba has better infrastructure than a lot of countries in the Caribbean. Cuba has a better public transportation system. People aren't going hungry and dying from malnutrition in Cuba, and you have that in some other parts of the Caribbean. I saw the other day that it made global news that, oh my God, Cuba is approaching the UN for the first time in its history to get food, and it's calling on assistance from the World Food Program. The entire Caribbean region for the past 5 years has been talking about the fact that many of the islands are food insecure. Many of the islands have high import content of Western food. And what does that mean when inflation is high in Western countries, especially around food? If we are here complaining, saying, oh my God, eggs are costing us $8, how much do you think it's costing to those people in the Caribbean region that are importing food and then having to buy it? How you get a can of soda on inflation prices in the US for $3 and in the Caribbean, it would cost me $8. And the people are working there on a wage that is a lot lower than mine. And people don't want to talk about these regional dynamics at all because talking about the regional dynamics does not allow them to absolve dependent capitalism that exists in the Caribbean region. So when Cuba is going to the World Food Program for the first time in decades, a lot of people view that as the major story. My first inclination was to say, oh my God, how much worse is the food crisis in other Caribbean countries, right? But people seem to ignore or belie that fact. The same time Cuba is going to the World Food Program, Guyana and the Netherlands and Guyana and all of these other countries are trying to make deals to bring food into their country to make sure that they don't go under due to food. And these are capitalist Caribbean countries, right? And so I say all of this because we have to study Cuba and we have to seriously study Cuba in relation to other Caribbean countries. And we cannot exceptionalize the Cuban Revolution. It is not that Cuba's revolution happened and that was that and the society is the best. No, the masses are still leading Cuba's direction and Cuban society in some way. How is that different from other islands, right? Why is education and literacy much higher in Cuba, which we're told is under this oppressive regime for all of these years? Why is it higher in Cuba than it is across the rest of the Caribbean that has been allowed into or integrated into the Western capitalist system? These are the kinds of questions that we should be asking. Why are maternal mortality rates higher in other Caribbean countries than it is in Cuba? Why are malnutrition rates higher in other Caribbean countries than it is in Cuba? Those are the kinds of questions we have to be asking. And then we have to say, well, what policies are Cuba instituting that makes their outcomes better than those in other Caribbean countries? And if these policies instituted in Cuba are having better outcomes, why are they not being replicated in other Caribbean countries? But people don't want to ask these questions because then they'll have to look into issues of foreign domination, economic capture of whole industries, unequal trade deals, and the fact that dependent capitalism doesn't lead to development. What does it mean that Guyana is going to extract 150 billion barrels of oil? Why is Guyana set to extract $150 billion of oil? The headline, if Guyana doesn't own or have any capacity to extract oil in its country, it's being done by foreign corporations. Why are we saying, or why are we championing Irfan Ali for saying, oh, we are net zero, without acknowledging the fact that any pollution that comes out of Guyana due to oil extraction will continue to be from Western countries and not Guyana. Guyanese don't have the capacity to extract oil. And so I think Cuba is the most illustrative example for us in terms of what Caribbean societies can achieve for people if the goal of development is to better the lives of people. And if that betterment of life for people is not happening in other Caribbean countries, we need to be able to analyze why that is the case. And that doesn't happen because people don't want to condemn the sort of dependent capitalism that other Caribbean countries are succumbed to. Something else that we need to study is why developing and expanding literacy rates and political consciousness of people are very important. Something that people also take for granted is the fact that democracies run better when people are educated. People like to pretend that Cuba is an undemocratic society, even though people still have insight and still vote on many of the laws that lead Cuban society forward. They talk about, oh, Cuba has the most progressive family code, but then they pretend it's something that the government passed that was unbeknownst to the people, or the people had no role in. No, the people had a role in that. How can you say that this society is backwards when this society is still guaranteeing more rights for people than even you and your so-called Western liberal democracy? We have to study the political consciousness of people and why education is important, and not just why education is important, but also why making sure that propaganda doesn't become the rule or the law of the day uh, should not be taken for granted. I see people also talk about, oh, in countries like Cuba, in countries like China, or in countries like North Korea, people are propagandized because of censorship, right? But what does that mean? Well, for us, it means here that we are not propagandized and we don't have censorship. So now it's okay to have these massive incel cultures that wouldn't have allowed a family law to pass in the United States like it did in Cuba. I don't really view that as a win if the goal is equality between every single person that lives in a society and cohabits a society together. But some people view it that way. And also, I'm not of the belief, and I also share this a lot of times, but your false information should not have the same sort of room, capacity, or space to be shared as someone who has information that wants to help better progress society. We can have debates on how to help to better everyone's standards in society, but you don't have a say in that debate if it's no, rights should be exclusive to X, Y, and Z people. And so I think the terms of the debate that Cubans have are much more intellectual than our own. And that is also something that should be studied as well.
I appreciate that a lot. As you were talking about the comparison of Cuba to other countries in the Caribbean, it reminded me, I had a professor in undergrad, Patricia Saunders, who uh, made that very point to us and showed us like the film Life and Debt, which like I don't know if you've seen it, but it's like 2001 documentary about Jamaica, talking about the IMF and kind of the neo-colonial imperial policies there. But yeah, she made that exact point that you're making, which is not a common one for make people to make. People always want to try to compare the quality of life in like suburban America or something like that to Cuba, as opposed to um and how do we define quality of life would be a whole other conversation. But as opposed to saying like let's compare Cuba to Jamaica, let's compare Cuba to other islands in the Caribbean and talk about the real realities on the ground. Folks don't want to do that, of course. So that brings us to Grenada. And I'm reminded, like, when we talked to Dion Brand, of course she was in Grenada at the time and didn't really want to discuss the imperialist assault because it was so painful to kind of go back to revisit that. But she had this story too about, like, after the Cuban Revolution, she had an uncle that just got, like, a small little one-person, like, dinghy basically, and was like, "I'm going to Cuba," from, from Guyana, right? Or no, Trinidad, right? Trinidad. Um, and, and then, of course, she then went to Grenada years later and had this vision that she was like she saw somebody and she was like not quite sure if it was her uncle. And so it was just kind of a funny, story. But obviously, you know, Grenada is the most beautiful, I mean, most recent. It was a beautiful example for many, many Black internationalists and socialists and communists from that generation, like moved there or went there and visited, um, contributed to the revolution and, all kinds of things that were going on in terms of education and, other stuff that was just going on the island at the time. And unfortunately, it was more short lived as a revolutionary project because of the counter revolution that was waged against the revolutionary gains. So, talk a little bit about Grenada, which you look at in kind of relation to both thinking about the Haitian and the Cuban example.
Yes. And so every time I read anything about the Grenada Revolution, I also get sad because it was something very hopeful and it had all of this potential. But I get sad because of what the counter-revolutionary period in Grenada looked like. And so me including Grenada in that thread was to point out that sort of the counter-revolutionary environment that happened in Grenada is precisely what people are advocating for whenever they make these calls to overthrow the Cuban government. Like after the counter-revolution or after the U.S. and conservative Caribbean government's invasion of Grenada, there was an intentional illiteracy push in the country. And what I mean by this is that US officials said people in Grenada are too educated. They don't have this will or wherewithal to yet oppose communism or socialism. So we need to increase illiteracy. We need to increase the illiteracy rate in Grenada so that people aren't learned on sort of the history, the revolution, and what happened. And a big part of that illiteracy campaign, and I hope that I'm pronouncing illiteracy well, meaning that they didn't want people to be educated or learn. A big part of that campaign included sort of mass firing of women and sort of denouncing women being able to teach. And this is important because people think that when we talk about sort of Western imperialism and Western aggression and how it incentivizes patriarchy, people think that we're talking about something abstract. But when you actually study Grenada and you view the condition of women in the post-revolutionary period, what you see is an intentional, no, you must see them as inferior, what they're doing is wrong, women shouldn't be hired here. And so there was also an aggressive campaign to push women out of public life, out of the educational sectors, and to limit their role in society. And sometimes people also believe, well, women are the carriers of culture. And that also influenced their beliefs to sort of denigrate women's status in post-invasion Grenada, precisely because they believed that it was women and women's education and women being too educated that was furthering along sort of the political consciousness of the Grenadian people. And so again, massive illiteracy campaign, massive intentional denigration of women in public life and women in society. And then you also had sort of this denunciation of agriculture and anything industrious in Grenada society. And so when you look at the sort of post-invasion period of Grenada, what you saw was all of these intentional steps precisely so that Western institutions and Western investments can take over. Because it is not just that you denigrate women in society and that's it. You denigrate women in society and now say these Western NGOs and these Western dominated international institutions are best suited to educate you all on how women in society should be and why you're not there yet. It's not just you have this illiteracy campaign, but it's also to say when education is reinstituted, you are to learn this propagandized narrative of why the invasion environment was good for you. It, didn't lead your country into war. And so it's not, so it's sad because you get to, when you read about this history and you read about the aftermath, you get to see in real time sort of how neo-colonial takeover happens. And you get to see in real time how Western integration of a Caribbean society can happen in sort of the modern era or like the modern setting. Because again, this was in the late 1970s, 1980s that we're talking about. And so I'm trying to remember exactly what the question was. But in essence, Grenada was unable to defend itself from imperialist aggression due to an internal split between those party members who believed that they were following a more stricter code or a more principled code of Marxist-Leninist scientific revolution, and another sector that was just following the masses. And it brings this question to bear again that the Haitian Revolution also had to bear with. When we upset social and economic relations, we have to create new ones. You had one sector in Grenada that believed that these new ones should be scientifically informed in one way. And then you had another sect that believed that how social and economic relations are built and rebuilt and reconstituted should be led by the masses. And it is always my belief that those things should be led by the masses. Why? Because sometimes in theory or in abstract, things just don't work the way that they work. And it was that internal split of, I guess, what some people would call well intentioned people, which is also one of the saddest things of it all, that allowed or gave room for the imperial onslaught to happen in the country. And so whenever people talk about overthrowing the Cuban government, I wanted people to be aware of the fact that what they're talking about is creating a Cuba that looks more like Haiti or that looks more like post revolutionary Grenada, which is a massive illiteracy campaign, given the amount of consciousness, political consciousness, positive political consciousness that exists in the country, a mass denigration of women campaign, precisely because you want to incentivize patriarchal methods of exploitation and accumulation for your foreign investments and companies that come in afterwards, and the sort of NGOs that are allowed to flourish in these sorts of counter-revolutionary, post-revolutionary societies. And so Grenada provides us with an example and also a relevant modern example for what conditions look like for countries that have revolutions and then are forcefully reintegrated into Western capitalism. And Haiti gave us the examples of countries that have revolutions and are still trying to be forcefully integrated into Western capitalism, precisely because its long history of rejection to that system informs just a basic consciousness amongst the people that forced integration into that system is not beneficial to us.
Much appreciated. So do have one more question I'm gonna bring in. But folks, if you have questions in the audience, feel free. Now's a good time to put those in the chat. Um, of course, in this thread, like you again, as we kind of started, the starting point of this was this conversation that you had around Haiti. And you used it to lay out these three different examples to kind of show these different approaches, these different trajectories, what happens when countries take certain paths, etc. And obviously also to highlight, as you have throughout this, like the role of the masses and of the consciousness of the masses. So let's tie it back now to the current situation in Haiti and kind of the connections you were trying to draw out through this whole conversation.
Um, so the current situation in Haiti, it's being framed in democratic terms. And I think that it's important to highlight that it's being framed in democratic terms, just as it was important for me to highlight the difference earlier on between positive political consciousness and negative political consciousness. Democracy is not a neutral term. Democracy can also be positive and it can also be negative. And when I say democracy can be positive or negative, I'm not simply talking about, oh, is the simple manner of voting. Whenever most people are talking about democracy in the present, they're talking about sort of Western liberal democracy. And I think that this is important because when we say Western liberal democracy, or we put liberal democracy before, or we put liberal before democracy, or Western liberal before democracy, that is intentional because what we're essentially talking about is capitalism. And so when we say Western liberal or even liberal democracy, what we're pointing out is the fact that the West or liberal democracies have a commitment to maintaining their preferred version of democracy. And so, in me pointing out that you have to compare Cuba to other countries, and me talking about Haiti's global context and all of these things, currently the West wants to maintain the facade of democracy in Haiti through this presidential council or through electing Haitian presidents, even though those presidents are never elected, because it wants to maintain Haiti as a capitalist entity integrated into itself, even as the Haitian people are rejecting that. And I think it was Alahar who said that for the West, maintaining the facade of democracy under capitalism has always been more important than the actual substance of the democracy itself. And again, maintaining the facade of democracy under capitalism has always been more important than the actual substance of that democracy itself. And this is why we don't compare Cuba to other Caribbean countries, because then you would have to have a conversation about the substance of what capitalist or Western liberal democracy has looked like in other Caribbean countries. And so today, what we have is a Western liberal imposed democracy or democratic system in Haiti. And they are doing that because they don't want Haitians to win out in that battle of democracy. Um, and, the battle for democracy, of course, for Marx was, the first step in revolution. What happens when Haitians are allowed to elect their own leaders? Well, Haitians tend to want to elect leaders that will protect workers' rights, increase the minimum wage, institute more social welfare, give people more freedom. But giving people more freedom isn't what the West wants, because they want to maintain Haiti as a low wage manufacturing hub in the Caribbean and as a country where its selected presidents easily sell off Haitian land for mining to US and Canadian companies. And so all of those things are at odds with what the Haitian people would want. And so you cannot have them elect. And this has been, again, the case since Haiti's revolution happened, this forceful integration, this denying of what the Haitian masses wanted in order to get them into your preferred regime of liberal capitalist Western governance. And so Henry Kissinger, and again, Alahar used him, but it's a good example. But he was very public in saying, I don't see why we need to stand idly by and watch a country go communist due to the irresponsibility of its own people. Ever since the Haitian Revolution, the West has viewed Haitians as irresponsible people. And when you view them as irresponsible people, you can at once blame them of everything that goes bad in the country and absolve yourself from that blame, even though you are the one to blame for what happens in that country. And also, two, say that they are so irresponsible that they cannot be trusted to elect leaders to govern themselves correctly. And so, even though those two things are contradictions in and of themselves, uh, it reinforces all of the negative stereotypes that people already globally have about Haitians, because Haiti and Haitians have been so securitized that people will believe anything that's backwards, negative, or irresponsible about Haitians rather than just investigating or seeing the truth. So I'm on here not telling you anything new. When Jemima comes, she's not telling anyone anything new. No one is telling anyone anything new. We're just pointing out sort of these historical facts, these historical truths, these present day realities, what Haitian people are actually saying. But because they have been securitized and everyone everywhere views Haitians as these irresponsible, backwards people, they are being ignored and not listened to. And so to talk about Haiti in the present is to talk about a history of imperialism that is embedded and entrenched in the relations between Western states, international organizations, and Haiti. And people want to absolve all of the blame off of Western states and these international organizations because the Haitian people have already been successfully propagandized as irresponsible, backwards, nothing good can come of them. If Haitians were to be gotten rid of, no one would care, right? And I've also been very vocal on Twitter how, in this time where we see sort of massive disruptions in propaganda narratives, especially as it relates to Palestinian struggle, we should also be very forceful in sort of denouncing these myths around Haitians and Haiti so that people start to actually learn about and want to learn about the struggle there, why it's being raised, why it's being waged, and why it's been waged for so long. Um, Unlike other Caribbean states in the region, or unlike the majority of Caribbean states in the region, not all of them, because we do have Cuba, but unlike other states in the Caribbean region whose independence was granted once European powers decided that the colonies would be a financial burden, and so all of a sudden these people are fit to rule themselves, uh, Haitians won their independence at the time where they were the most profitable sugar colony in the region. So it wasn't just that all of these plantation societies existed and they were all equal. The Haitian Revolution happened when Haiti was the most profitable sugar colony in the region. And not only that, but Haitians had to become politically aware very quickly prior to their revolution, precisely because the life expectancy of a Haitian, of an enslaved African in Haiti, was 48 hours. That's how cruel the plantation system was in Haiti, and that's why it was the most profitable plantation system. So you have this narrative today in the Caribbean or in the Western Hemisphere that, oh, Portuguese and Spanish colonialisms and enslavement were nicer, French was the worst. No, colonialism is colonialism, enslavement is enslavement. But when they say France was the worst, they are just pointing out that life expectancy for enslaved Africans were literally 48 hours or less in the richest and most profitable plantation colony at that time, which was Haiti. And so when Haitians won their independence, that political consciousness was, they basically saw around them people dying at alarming rates. And I say this, one, because every time I see sort of the, oh, they shouldn't have killed all the white people in Haiti narratives, it's like, do you know what the situation was like in Haiti? And it's not just that the Haitian Revolution killed white people, but enslaved Africans or Africans fighting for their freedom also died during that revolution. And who do you think had the most gunpowder initially during that revolution? And so there are all of these sorts of absurd claims. And the reason why it's always important to go back to that moment and talk about that history is because, and also the reason why it's important to talk about political consciousness is because a lot of the propaganda that is believed about Haiti, in my mind, just in the Caribbean region and then also in the Western world, is a sort of internalized white supremacy against Haitians. Because how dare they have revolted for their freedom in the late 1700s? But that how dare they have revolted is never then backed by why would a revolt have happened in Haiti? What conditions made it so that by the late 1700s, you would have an island have a massive slave revolt where even Creoles allied with enslaved Africans, even though they had a better social standing? Something must have been happening for that to have happened, but people never want to investigate that. And again, what you do is you absolve yourself of the inherent racism, anti-Blackness, and your own sort of inferior, superior mindset towards Haitians so that you don't have to, in the present, understand what their current struggle is about and why it's been waged, has been waged for decades, right? If you are in the West and you believe in democracy, be honest with yourself and say that you support Western liberal democracy or a negative type of democracy that integrates Haitians into capitalism. And so you are fine with the fact that Haitians will continuously die and continuously not have a say in how their lives are or how their society is ran because you view them, whether subconsciously or not, as irresponsible, as backwards, etc., because you bought into the narratives, the propaganda narratives, or the negative political consciousness that's been proliferated about Haiti and Haitians by the West for, at this point, centuries.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate the point you made too about, using this time when it is so clear how egregious the, corporate media propaganda apparatus is with respect to Palestine. That it's important to then generalize that understanding for people in terms of like all of the different, whether it's Haiti, whether it's Congo, whether it's Sudan, whether, whatever, like that that there's it's a propaganda machine. I mean, and that was the funny point, you made in terms of people, the idea that people, because they live in a state socialist society, are more propagandized, than people in like the United States. I mean, like I don't think there's any people in the United States that are more propaganda. I mean, any people in the world that are more propagandized more effectively than people in the United States,
I would add the
Um,
people in Canada. Since moving here,
mm.
I knew it would be bad when I came here, but since moving here, sort of the liberalism that permeates every aspect of Canadian culture also doesn't allow them to break through uh, sort of that propaganda. And so I think that Western liberal democracies are very good at reinforcing propaganda narratives to their citizens, that even when their citizens find out that, oh, you lied to me, it doesn't beckon them to interrogate anything else because they believe, well, it could always be worse in this other country I've been propagandized about. And so it belies them of any, further investigation. Like a lot of people don't know about Canada's role in the partition. A lot of people don't know about Canada's role in sort of planning the intervention and planning the coup in 2004 Haiti. A lot of people believe, oh, Canada just went there and secured the airport for the US. And it's like, no, Canada hosted the initial talks in 2003 to plan out the 2004 coup as a result of not just the Haitian elections, but Aristide instituted neoliberal reforms, or where he went too far was talking about increasing the minimum wage, right? And so you have these sort of historical biases that sort of are downplayed in Canada, that they believe their country is just always this neutral actor in the world. And it's like, that has no basis in reality or in history.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of my friends, comrades in Canada, do always talk about how in Canada, like the big kind of propaganda narrative that just like floats among, even kind of left liberal folks is like, well, at least we're not the US. Like the US are the really bad folks, but we're not like them, and we have healthcare, we have this, we have that, and it's sort of like yeah, that's an insidious thing. So yeah, it's cool that you're there and that you're doing the work that you're doing also on Canadian imperialism because I think that we have that view in the US too often of Canada of like oh they're not really it's better there, right? Like that's kind of so anyway, all right, audience questions. I do have a couple. So this was just a simple one early on. You could probably answer this pretty quickly. This was early on as you were talking about Haiti. Someone asked why you put quotes around the term corruption with regard to Haitians, Haitian officials.
So the reason why I put corruption in quotes is because a lot of people like to think of corruption as something that is naturally occurring in Haiti without viewing that corruption is incentivized in Haiti. There's a reason why uh, dictators are supported in Haiti. There's a reason why, even though Haitians have not elected a president in their country for almost 2 decades now, all of Haiti's presidents that's been selected by the US and these other Western states are corrupt. If we are saying that we have Haiti under our tutelage and we're electing the presidents, how then can corruption be to blame? It's obviously that you have an investment in corruption occurring, so that is why corruption exists. And so I put corruption in quotes because I don't want people to assume that it is something natural or inherent to, irresponsible Haiti and Haitians. But corruption is something that is sustained maintained and enforced and actually put into power by the West, because Haitians haven't elected a president again in almost 2 decades.
Yeah, and I think it's an important point, and I think it's always, I mean, it's not like you said, it's not to say that corruption doesn't exist, in Haiti or anywhere else in the planet, right? Like, but how does it become that that's like there's so many other instances where we could point out and say like, oh, this is because, people don't talk about corruption within the United States very much at all, right? And it's like a whole system where almost everything is incentivized by corporate interests, lobby groups, etc. Like, and within a lot of countries in the global south, they would definitely see that as corruption, if when those things occur, right? And so it's like it just becomes this, it's a form of narrative, right? It's just something that's placed on to say, oh, well, this is why we have to intervene, right? um that it's just convenient and not something that is really held in some sort of universal standard of, like there's a global fight on corruption, like, please.
Yeah. And
um
also, this corruption also aids the sort of Western security narratives that we have, because you have people
yeah.
saying like, "Oh, Haiti's government is corrupt," but again, Haitians haven't elected a government. They viewed every single president for the past 2 decades as illegitimate, precisely because it's been picked for them by the U.S. And so, when you say Haiti's government is corrupt, and so you need to bring in sort of security forces to stabilize this backwards government, what you're essentially saying is that the corruption that's been necessitated by who's been picking presidents in Haiti for the past 2 decades uh, justifies a security presence. But then what you're essentially saying is that Western corruption that's been incentivized in Haiti justifies a Western security presence, and Western corruption and governance have only been detrimental to Haitians, and Western security being brought into Haiti will only be detrimental to Haitians. So at some point, you people need to look in the mirror and say, well, if this is corruption, are you now saying that somehow the U.S., Canada, France, its EU allies, Brazil, Mexico, and all these other people can't pick a corrupt or can't pick someone who won't be corrupt? Like, you have to start to ask, why is this person corrupt in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely, that's a great point. And I just started smiling to myself thinking about Bob Menendez. But anyway, so there's a couple of different really, questions for recommendations. One, books on kind of the new situation or current situation in Cuba, and then recommendations for any media to learn more about Haiti, Cuba, and the Grenada human revolutions. Um, those are big asks for you on the spot, but I don't know. You probably rattle a few things off.
So yes, I'm actually pulling up one of my sites, but there's this. One second. There's this really good. Um, and it would probably do me much better to just open up my Safari search, but I don't want to mess up my internet. But there's a really good blog site that's ran by a woman in Cuba, and I always read it to sort of get analysis on sort of any sort of policy changes and stuff that happens in Cuba. And yeah, it's called Capire, Capire. But they have really good analysis on Cuba and what is happening in Cuba. And so I tend to read their site the most, and I will spell it out in the chat. And sorry if my computer is freezing. I have a very old computer. And so for me to like type in uh, that, it messes up. But they give good analysis on Cuba. Uh, in regards to Haiti, there's Haiti Liberté. There's also, you could read Hood Communist, Black Agenda Report, and there's two Haitian Creole sites, but they allow you to fully translate the sites into English. And sorry, I'm trying to type things in my Safari web address since I have this open up on Google Chrome. It's okay. I'll just give up. But I would say that going to Haiti Liberté, going to the Communist Black Agenda Report, those are all good sites to get great news and analysis. I always listen to everything that Jemima Pierre does. She's a great scholar on this issue as well. And I would say that those are my main sources of information. Outside of that, I would say that my biggest source of information for me is always WhatsApp because I know people in these countries and in these places. And so sometimes they just send me messages on WhatsApp, which is how I'm alerted to news and stuff. But obviously, I'm not giving out WhatsApp numbers. But yeah, I get a lot of my information from WhatsApp. But if people are looking for direct sources, I would say prepare Haiti Liberté, the Communist Black Agenda.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for doing this. This was a great conversation. I really appreciate it. Added a lot to our knowledge and our thinking about these revolutions, especially in relation to each other as examples. And folks from all the way from Tunis and other places around the world obviously are tuning in. So thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to the people who watched and anyone else. Say hi to my mom, and that's it.
Hi, Mom.